Hi, my name is James. Welcome to King's Fine Woodworking. Today I am going to show you how to build this contoured box joint or finger joint bench. And I'm going to do something a little bit different in this video than I normally do because oftentimes I use one plan for different projects. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that, and I'll expand on that as the video goes. So if you stick around to the end, you'll see what I'm talking about, and you'll see the other thing that I put together with this. We've got a pretty good, highly figured selection of wood here, and I think even our bench dog approves. Of course, I think she probably prefers the name Princess, which is what my mom gave her when my mom was still with us, so we'll leave it at Princess. So to start with, I went out and bought a walnut 8/4 board, and I've had this maple for a while. This is quilted maple, Pacific Coast quilted maple. Had it for a long time. It's got some defects in it, some I think they were probably bark inclusions or some sort of damage that was in the tree, and probably that damage is what gave this thing all of its nice figure. So we're going to use up some of this stuff, and I'm going to use up this damaged stuff because I don't know, I think I can make it look nice, and I don't really have any other projects I can use this for currently. Next, we're going to take the time to mill everything down, which means I'm going to start with surfacing one flat side first and then one edge, and then we'll take it over to the planer. So I designed this to be a piano bench. It's going to be for my wife. She likes to play the piano, and so do my daughters, and they all get together, and sometimes 2 or 3 of them will try to play at once. So I made it fairly wide for a piano bench, but it'll serve its purpose. Anyhow, once I finished the design, I realized that there are a couple other things that I would like to build with this design, which kind of made me think of John Malecki's videos in a way. I'm sure most of you know who John Malecki is, and if you don't, I'm going to put a link to his channel down below. He's a really cool woodworker. He's got a funny channel. You should check it out. But at any rate, in his videos, he does a thing quite often where he'll say 3 levels of a coffee table or 3 levels of a cabinet, which is pretty cool. But in a way, it's kind of the exact opposite of what I do. He has a system in his videos where he shows 3 different designs to achieve the same project. And quite often what I do is one design that can make 3 different projects or more. It's kind of different, and it's kind of interesting. So I thought that I would expand this video just a little bit and show you what I mean by that. All right, so we're back to the milling here. We had it face jointed, then an edge jointed, and now I am planing the top to get everything down to a uniform thickness. I should mention that if you're interested in these plans, I will have a link in the description down below so that you can pick up a set of these for yourself. As with all of my plans, every plan we have that for every video that we've done is on our website, and there's a link to that. And here I'm jumping back over to the walnut. We've already milled this walnut down, and I am chopping out some legs for our bench. Then we'll take them over to the table saw, and we will cut them to the appropriate width. And you might notice we have a new saw. We have a SawStop in the shop now. I've had this thing for a few months, and I think I'll probably report on it, kind of give it some updates, my thoughts on it in the next couple of videos or so. We've switched out from the Grizzly, and there's a few reasons for it, but I'll definitely go over all that in the future. All right, now we're going to jump back to the maple, and I want to do the same thing with the maple. We're going to cut that down to be the same width as the walnut legs. It's part of the design of the bench that these two are exactly the same in width. And we'll get a chance to use this natural lumber defect here, which I think was probably a bark inclusion. It's kind of a folded over pocket of bark that is found more on the interior portion of the tree. I know the grain is definitely really, really beautiful. This wild figure grain is going to really look stunning in 3D once we get this project finished. Now for something that some of you might see as a little bit unusual. I'm actually going to plane down the ends of these boards. And I'm doing this because I've got the planer set at a specific height here, and I'm going to plane them all so that they're all identical in width. The more perfect they are, the better the project's going to turn out. And that goes for the legs too. I want the legs to be identical in width to the top. And you'll see why when we get to the assembly phase, but doing them on the planer really makes them perfect. I like to do a quick test on the cast iron surface of the bed here and just make sure that they are in fact identical, and these are perfect. Now to do some layout on these boards, I could measure and mark and all that stuff, but I've already done those calculations on the computer, so I just created a quick little template to make it perfect for me, make it easy, make it go fast. And if you were to buy the plans, this is just included as one of the pages of the plans, so you'd have the templates to make these perfect. All right, so I haven't printed the plans yet, but I'm just going to show you on the computer version here what these templates are for. This is kind of the top angle of the leg, looking down from the very top of that portion of the leg, and you can see the angle that's marked out there. And you see how this fits the top. It's actually the same one up here as it is at the very bottom. Same leg angle. We just flip it around to get the other side. And then board A is going to be the outermost board on the top and the bottom of the whole bench, and that's the angle that's going to get cut at. And board B, which is the next board down, is going to be the second one in from both sides. And so I've kind of laid it out here. I've just marked the tops, and I've just kind of counted them over board 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can lay this out any way you want. Doesn't really matter. Just decide, put your pretty side up however you want to build the bench. And I've kind of turned this up like this. This is what I want it to look like. And so the outermost board is board A. That's how I have it marked here. And so we're going to set this here right at the end. Now these boards are longer than they need to be right now. They're a couple of inches longer than they need to be. So we're going to first put the angles and then cut them to length. So here's the angle here. That's pretty straightforward. We'll just make a quick mark, and it's going to actually be that same template piece for the opposite side. The next one in, it gets pushed back a little bit because this is how the legs go together. And then that one sticks out, the third one, the middle one, and then the next one in pushes in again. So that's kind of how the assembly comes together. Well, we're still on board A here, and that board A is the same on the outside. All we have to do is flip this upside down, and it's the same angle over here. So we'll do the same thing there. We'll just draw it to fit. And remember, these boards are longer than they need to be. And drawing the line super exact isn't super critical because I'm going to give you the angles of them anyway to put your miter saw at. And so on board B, which is the next board in, it has this cut, this angle cut. It's a little bit less steep. It's about half as steep of an angle as the first board, but they're on the opposite end. They're on the opposite end of the bench top. So we'll do the same thing here. We'll draw that in. And I often use a marker. I just can't find my marker. Makes it a little bit easier to see on video.
Did you zoom in far enough to see that?
And that end goes straight. So push this back in. And we're going to grab board B from the opposite side, which is the one that's one end from the end. And it's the same template. It's just going to be template B. But as you know, we're going to flip it upside down because we want the opposite angle. We're basically trying to form a curve or an arc along these. And we're just going to draw that in as well. So that's how that goes. The other end of it's going to get cut straight. So there's the layout. Now we're going to take this over to the chop saw and start doing our cuts. We'll start with cut A first. Doesn't really matter where you start, but start with cut A first. And that is the angle of the end of it. The other end's going to be square, but we're not going to cut it quite yet. So this is the other one here. The other board A, but you see the angle's kind of facing the wrong way now. But I could just flip the board upside down. I could either, move the bed of the saw over and cut it the other way, or I can just flip the board upside down. It'll achieve the same effect. Where exactly it cuts on the board isn't critical, as long as I just cut right at the end, because remember, they haven't been cut to length quite yet. And we can see how they angle in together. And next we'll cut board B, which is like the second board in from each side. And we're just going to follow the same set of sequences here. Then we'll just cut the other board B with the opposite angle, and the final board, the middle board, is just square to square, no angles on that one. Okay, with our angles cut, let's cut the lengths of these boards. And we're going to cut from the long part of the angle to square. In every instance, I'm going to hook the tape measure on the longest section, so it's from the long part of the angle to square. And of course, all the dimensions are included in the plans if you wanted to get those. And I'll even draw a nice line to make sure that we're square. And then we'll chop these guys to exact length. Those would be board A. But it's the exact same technique for board B. We're going to go from the long of the angle to a square cut, with the center board just being square to square. Now we're going to jump to the legs, and by legs there are of course many pieces, but ultimately they become one leg on each side. And I've done the same basic thing. I've used the template. This is leg X, draw it on one side, flip it, and that's the angle on the other side. And then leg Y, one side, and then flip it to the other side. And that's how we make those dimensions. And of course the very center one is a straight line. There is no curve in the centerpiece. That's why the bench top at that point is also square to square. So all I do is just line up, make sure those are flush at the top, make a mark, and you see I found my marker. And straight line there. And that's kind of the arc that the leg will follow. If we were to look down from the top, we would see that arc in the leg on each side. So we'll need to take this over to the bandsaw to cut it out. And I've tilted the bandsaw to the appropriate amount of degrees. And if your bandsaw doesn't have the degrees indicated, which some don't, you can use the template and just line up the template with the blade. Or line up the mark there with the blade. And that's it. We'll go ahead and push through. And I have a push block, and I can't find my... I couldn't find my push block for this, but it's a good idea to hold this up against the fence with like a feather board, for example. I didn't mean push block, I meant a feather board. Push block, of course, to help us push that through. So there's the first piece, and you see the angle that that's cut at. And that's fairly smooth cut. We'll have to do some sanding, but there it is. And you can see that once we get done with all of these, we're going to have a really nice arc here. So while the saw is set, I'm going to go, there it is, I found it. So this is a really nice feather board. If you guys need a feather board for your bandsaw, and of course you do, you should consider these mag switch feather boards. I love these things. I use them for everything, for my table saw, for my bandsaw. I'm going to put a link to these in the description in case that's something that you might need or might be interested in. It's cool because this thing is a feather board on both sides. A lot of them aren't, but the mag switch ones are. All right, sweet. I've got the other side all cut out. And now I have started on the second one in. So you see that I have that one on the left done, and I have the one on the right done. And now, of course, the middle one is just a straight cut. And that's our arc. Now, I know it's not actually a smooth arc. It's kind of a segmented arc. These are angles. But we're going to sand that to approximate a pretty close curve. Before we do that, of course, we're going to have to glue this up. And I like Titebond's dark wood glue for this. This is great stuff because it really dries to be about the same color as walnut. And you can use a brush, you can use your finger, you can use your face, you can use whatever you want to put this glue on. I like to glue both sides of the wood. That way there's no question about whether or not you have enough glue. One bottle of glue should suffice for this project. Large, maybe a gallon, I don't know. All right, and then we'll clamp it up. And one thing I do want to do is make sure that the bottom is all lined up. The tops, you see every other one, the height differs, and that's because they interlock with the top, the bench top. So once you get a little bit tight, you can tap it with a hammer, and then when you're all done, you do want to take a damp rag and clean off the excess glue. And I've got clamps on the top, clamps on the bottom to kind of even out the pressure, and that's it. We're going to set that aside to dry, and we're going to glue up the other one. And you can see how the tops alternate in height there. Now we'll turn our attention to the bench top. You'll see in some of these little pockets here, there's a little bit of bark left from this bark inclusion. We've got to get that out. That doesn't finish well. It won't hold a finish. It's going to come off later anyway, so we got to get rid of it. So I just kind of chisel the big stuff off, and then we can use a wire brush to get the other stuff off, the little bits that I can't chisel out. And then I'll kind of smooth up a few of those wire brush marks and return it back to sort of a normal look there. And blow the air out of it. All right, so one thing that I want to do to make this thing decorative is I want to put like a cutout, a relief cutout here on the very front part of the bench. It's decorative and it's kind of makes it a little more comfortable, makes the front a little bit less rigid. So I've made the layout with that curved board. I've bent it and drawn the line, and then I've set my saw up at an angle, and this should do both. So it's actually a compound angle, but one of them is the curve of the bandsaw, and then one is the angle of the angle of the arc here. And you can see I'm not doing a very good job with the bandsaw. I'm cutting a little bit big, but that's okay. I got into it a little bit before I was paying close attention to where my blade was going. But we'll just go ahead and follow the whole cut either on or just slightly outside of that line. And it'll work out fine. I'm going to sand the whole thing down pretty smooth anyway, so if it's a 1/16 of an inch bigger or whatever, it's not going to really make any difference. It's just for looks. So the first thing I'll do is, the bandsaw is a fairly rough cut. I'm going to hit it with a belt sander with 36 grit paper. This is very aggressive, and this will immediately remove all of those bandsaw marks. Then I'll jump to an 80 grit paper to get rid of those belt sanding marks and give it a little bit more of a smoothed out feature. You can see it really didn't make any difference that it was a tiny bit bigger than what my pencil line was. We'll take a look at it after I've sanded it down to about 220. Or actually, this is 180, sorry. So I put a little bit of alcohol on the rag so we can just kind of get a look at it, make sure I don't have any deep scratches in it, and it looks pretty good. You see that grain looks pretty crazy. Really, really nice. And it is time to glue this up. So I've opened up my glue bot to what Matt Cremona calls the high flow setting, so that we can release large amounts of glue at once. And we'll just slap this glue down in place. Far more efficient than trying to get a small brush or a ruler. Here again, I want to glue both sides of every joint. Once I have all those glued up, then I'm going to need to separate these top pieces by the thickness of the walnut boards that are going in between them. So I've glued up one leg, but I didn't glue up the other on purpose. So I'm separating these by that thickness. You can see there on the left, I've got two legs to insert here. And once I've got those measurements laid out, I'll kind of flatten everything down. I've got a little bit of tension on the clamps, not too much, a little bit of pressure. Not too much. And I want to make sure that these are all the same height. That'll make for a little bit less sanding later. And then we'll crank it all the way down. Right, so then I'll put the first leg also in clamps once that bench top is done. And then I will start tackling the job of sanding these curves. So once again, I'm just going to start with the belt sander with some 36 grit, get it to rough shape. Then we're going to jump over to 80 grit on the random orbit and just keep right on sanding. A lot of what I'm doing to begin with is going back and forth sideways across the grain until I get it down to about where I want. Then I'll start sanding with the grain. I'll work through the grits. I'll go from 80 to 120, 150, up to 180. And then we'll pause there. We want to get everything sanded nicely. And you can see it looks a little bit more like an arc now rather than a segmented arc. There we go. There's one leg that's rough sanded. All right, so the top I did let sit overnight. Then we'll pull the clamps off. And I'm going to use a paint scraper, Norm Abrams style, and just take off the big chunks of glue that I let drip out Not really concerned about getting it down to perfect. I could do it by hand with the random orbit sander, but I'm going to go ahead and send this through a drum sander because I have one. Certainly isn't necessary. If you take the time to make sure they're all about at the same level before you apply the clamps, then sanding with a random orbit is relatively quick. Obviously, it's not as quick as this, but it certainly does work. So we'll do this on both sides and we'll get it to perfect. So I've enlisted the work help there of my wife. All right, so if we're looking at the seams here, we can see that this board has inclusion, but this one doesn't. So it looks a little strange to have that straight. So I might do a little bit of a cutout there to match that. Maybe not to match that, but just to give it a little bit of something because it looks a little bit out of place. It might have ended up being no big deal, but it only took a few seconds with a grinder. You could do it with a chisel, whatever, and just to kind of grind that down a tiny bit. All right, now once that's done, it is going to be time to assemble the whole project. So there's the top. That's what it looks like. We're going to turn it upside down to do the assembly. And we want lots of glue for this, of course. We're going to glue every contact surface on both pieces. And there's actually quite a lot of contact surface here. If you just count long grain to long grain, we have about 4 square inches per side. May not sound like a lot, but it's quite a bit. 4 square inches per side. That's about 8 square inches total. Type Bond tells us that Type Bond 3 has 3,200 pounds per square inch of strength. So 3,200 times 8 is quite a bit. We've got like maybe 25,000 pounds of force holding this thing together with just the glue bond. So this is really all that we need. Now, of course, we also have end grain to long grain glue up in here as well. And that's even a greater quantity. It's not nearly as strong as long grain to long grain. But what I'm getting at is this thing is more than strong enough so that I don't need any other type of fastener. All right, now it's time to clamp it all together. We've got it roughly assembled. This is one of the little cut-off pieces. I've sliced them up from the bandsaw cut to help me clamp. And of course, I want to constantly make sure this thing is square and stays square during the whole clamp-up process. It would be really weird to have a bench with legs that are cockeyed. So that's important. So I'm clamping it together from side to side, and I'm clamping the top down at the same time, maintaining my square with the square. And before the glue has a chance to fully set, I'm going to get a lot of the excess off right now. And then, of course, I'll use a damp rag and get the remainder. Makes my sanding time later just a little bit less. And we let that sit up overnight as well. If you like our channel, hopefully you'll take a moment to click the like button down below and subscribe. We really appreciate that, and that's what helps us grow. And if you want to support the channel or help us make more content, the best way to do that is either buy our plans or consider joining our Patreon page. There's a link to our Patreon in the description below. We're going to take a moment to sand down all of the surfaces and get them down to around 180 grit before we start dealing with those bark inclusion pockets. And you might notice this is a pretty good way to make a box joint or a finger joint without actually having to do all the special cuts required for a box joint. I'm not really a big fan of epoxy tables, but with this bark inclusion, my wife and I talked about it, and it's her bench, and she would like to see these things filled with epoxy. Maybe some sort of a translucent epoxy, transparent almost, so that she can see the crevice all the way down. It kind of looks neat, gives a neat 3D look to the piece. And so in order to do that, the first thing that we need to do is to seal the bottoms of these areas where the epoxy is going to fill. If we don't, bubbles could come up out of these after the epoxy is filled in and put bubbles in our epoxy on the surface, and that would look ugly. So we're sealing all of these with 5-minute epoxy. Just sealing the surface. And then once those are dry, that doesn't take very long, it's quick epoxy, we are going to mix up a batch of Total Boats thick-set epoxy. This stuff is measured by volume. It's just a 3-to-1 mix, and it actually works for pretty thick pours. The directions are on there as to how thick you can pour it. I've been using Total Boat for a while. There are a lot of epoxies out there, but to me, Total Boat is one of the easiest to use. They're pretty affordable, and they've got a big variety of products for different needs. So the first thing you do is mix it up really well, of course. And you're supposed to have it thoroughly mixed before you add any coloring to the mix. So my wife's favorite color is red. Her cars have always been red, and she wants red in her bench. And so that's what we are putting. I don't remember the color. I think it's a ruby red. Maybe we'll see it here, or I'll put a link in the description to it. It's just an alcohol ink, a pretty standard ink. Oh, there you go, by Picasso, looks like. And of course, since we've mixed it, it's full of bubbles. Now this isn't necessary because most of the bubbles in this stuff go away fairly well, but I didn't want any, and so I'm going to put these in a vacuum chamber. Inside of the vacuum chamber, we turn on the vacuum, and it, of course, pulls all the air out of the chamber, which consequently pulls all of the air bubbles and dissolved air out of the epoxy and makes the epoxy very clear. You can see the vacuum pressure is increasing there, which is decreasing the atmospheric pressure. And we can kind of watch this and see how it goes. You see it's already starting to pull some of the air out of the epoxy. It's actually really cool. The whole thing happens very fast. It starts foaming up. I think it was in the chamber for maybe about a minute total. I've condensed the time on this to just a few seconds to kind of see how it gets going. And as the pressure gets really low, it starts really increasing, or as the total vacuum gets really high, it starts rapidly increasing the bubbles, and then they just start dying down. And we see the solution turn clear. So the vacuum's still going. And of course it's very clear. So now when I pour it, there are no air bubbles in the mix. Of course I've got to pour it fairly slowly. But this is just one technique that you can use before you pour your epoxy and have it very smooth. You can apply heat to the surface. Sometimes that'll also help. So I put some Play-Doh around the edges of these areas in order to kind of catch the excess. I don't want it to run all over the tabletop because I want to make sure I fill this right up to the very tops of these. So if you pour slowly, you're going to minimize or prevent any extra bubbles. That looks pretty good. And we'll just kind of go around and do the same thing everywhere. Have some really shallow areas. The one problem with using a tinted epoxy where it's translucent, of course, is in the shallow areas, the color isn't as rich, isn't as deep. And so some of these reds are going to look like pinks, I think, when we get into the more shallow areas. But my wife said she's okay with that. She prefers red, but she understands, and we aren't going to excavate them all down to the same depth. It is what it is. But yeah, it's kind of a pink. And it looks like we didn't really press this stuff down quite enough, the Play-Doh. And so I'm going to have to put a little bit more of that on there. And I think we'll take a moment, and I only got one box of it, which had like 3 or 4, had 4 cans in it. So I ended up having to use it all to prevent this stuff from leaking out, because we poured it a little bit too deep, I think. But that's okay. It's cheap. I think it was like $2 for the whole container, or for the whole package of 4 containers. So we let it sit. I let it sit for a whole week. I think it's ready to go after about 4 days, but we got busy with another project, so we let it sit for longer. The Play-Doh here is fully dried out. I had to chip that off. And now these are all higher than I would like them to be, so I'm just using a number 4 bench plane here. And I'm going to plane the epoxy down. It's a little rough on the bench plane, but not as hard as exotic woods would be. I want to plane these down so where they're flat to the surface of my bench. Because I'm not going to be able to put this thing back through the drum sander, I'm going to have to hand sand these all down, and epoxy is harder than wood, so I don't really want the epoxy to be taller than the wood. I want it to be the same height when I start my sanding. And it is a little bit of a slow process to plane all these down. I think it took me 30 minutes or so to plane all these down flush with the surface, but that's okay. And then I want to put a little bit of a roundover detail on all the edges of the bench. Probably do roundover on the bottoms and the legs and maybe some bevels on the top. But I don't really want sharp corners. This is a 1/4 inch radius roundover, and I'm not using the full 1/4 inch depth, just sort of a part of it. So we get a little partial roundover here. And then we're going to apply the same thing on the legs. My daughter's holding it up in the air there for me. And we'll just do this all the way around the legs. It's also really important to do this on the bottom of the legs, kind of the feet area, because if this thing is sliding back and forth on a concrete or a hardwood floor, the edges could splinter. But if they're rounded over, then that's not very likely to happen. So we want to do that everywhere. And then I'll sand that nice round over and just make it look a little bit more uniform. It's not a big round over, but it's just enough to soften the edges. And then I have to take the time to get the whole top sanded flat. I really want to make sure I don't sand any one area more than any other area. And there's only one way to do that, because I'm going to have to sand this for a lot. And that is to pencil mark it everywhere. And I want to sand until the pencil marks are erased. But I don't want to sand anymore. Once the pencil marks are fully gone, I need to move on. And then I need to go over it again. And I think I started with a pretty coarse grit there, around 60 grit or so. And you can see I still got epoxy kind of in the grain a little bit. Started around 60 grit. I think I had to do 4 or 5 full passes, maybe 6 with just the 60 grit in order to get everything down to the same level and get all the epoxy out of the tops of the grains. So I might have taken off as much as a 16th or probably a little more than a 32nd. All right, so you see I've also beveled the top all the way around, just with a normal chamfer bit. Now I want to do something to dress up that really beautiful figuring in the wood. I am going to use a little bit of dye and a shellac. Mix these together. This is a red trans-tint dye mixed with shellac. And this might look extreme, but this is going to help me make this figure pop. So of course it's red. I'm hoping to get a tiny bit of reddish tint out of the whole project when it's done, and to help this grain pop and give it more of a 3D effect. So I'm just going to coat the whole surface, wipe it dry. It actually looks pretty extreme. You could almost do a project with this. This is pretty crazy looking. But of course we didn't leave it like that. Maybe I will do this one day. Looks kind of gothic or something. Maybe it belongs in an old book. I don't know. All right, and then of course we have to sand it all off. The thing with highly figured grain is it looks the way it looks because the grain doesn't run perfectly straight up and down along the length of the tree. It kind of waves in and out and in and out. So this flat surface, which we would consider long grain, is not just long grain. It's actually a combination of end grain and long grain, because it's undulating. It's moving in and out, maybe in a ribbon type pattern, and there's bits of end grain. Now when I'm sanding, I'm actually sanding all of this red off of the flat or long grain, but I can't get all that red out of the end grain. And so that end grain is going to be just a touch darker than the long grain. And that's going to give it a little bit more of an enhanced look when we apply the finish to it. And you'll kind of see when it's all done here. It's not absolutely required, but it's a nice step. I think it adds something to it. We're going to use Osmo. And apply a little bit of Osmo, kind of at not quite by the manufacturer's directions. I want it on a little thicker. I want to get it to work in. We've sanded the surface down to 180 grit so we could get some good absorption with this. You know, the finer that you sand the wood, the smaller the pores and the openings are, so the less Osmo you're going to get to soak in, or the less any hard wax oil type finish is going to soak in. So if you leave it a little bit more coarse, the sanding, the final sand, then you're going to get more to penetrate, and you'll ultimately end up getting a little more surface protection. You could even sand it or do something to the surface after that if you needed it a little bit smoother. But I like to start with it coarse so we get more of it to penetrate. They also have a thinner version of Osmo which would penetrate better, Wouldn't penetrate as good as leaving the surface coarse, but it's one way to achieve something similar. All right, so now we're going to jump to the tabletop. I like to pour some on here. Now this is also only sanded to 180 grit, so the epoxy is not perfectly clear at this point, the top of it. This is going to go a long way to making it clear, but it's still not, not real clear. Now I'm deviating from the manufacturer's instructions. I've put on a very thick coat, and this is like a 3M buffing pad, a white buffing pad, a non-grit, non-abrasive buffing pad. And I've got all the extra Osmo here, and I am put it on a buffer, and I'm really going to work this into the surface. This is going to cause the oil to penetrate deeply and give us a better finish, in my opinion, than just doing the thin coat that the manufacturer calls for. Now you can choose to follow the manufacturer's directions, or you could do something like this, but you see that grain starting to pop there? That's a combination of me working it in with this buffer and me having previously dyed this with that shellac and a little bit of color. It really gives a 3D effect to that grain. It is messy, as you notice, we're splattering everywhere, but I keep on buffing, and we eventually buff all the excess off the top. Then after I'm done fully wiping it down, we're going to let this cure overnight, do a second coat, we'll let that cure, and then we're going to come back and do one more treatment to try to get that epoxy much more transparent. And this is what it looks like after it's fully dried with both coats. Alright, so we are going to go through a series of sanding. I ended before at 180. I'm actually going to jump to 400 now. And we're going to start sanding this whole surface at 400 grit. Just a very light sand. It's enough to scuff up the surface. Then we're going to jump to 600 grit. And we're going to go over the whole top one more time. Again, just lightly. You can see the white areas. And then we're going to go to 800 grit. It's white because it's been sanded a little bit, so you can see kind of where we've sanded. But we're going to see that white slowly go away. Here's 1000 grit. We're getting smoother and smoother at this point. And that epoxy, all of the teeny scratches that are in the epoxy are slowly coming out. Then we're going to jump to 2000. You notice that this sandpaper is on a foam pad. But we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go over the whole surface very lightly. Then we'll jump up to 3000. It's also on a foam pad. Same thing, nothing different. We'll go over the whole thing real lightly. And if you notice, the white areas are gone. They're already turning back to the regular color. And we're going to do a final step with 4000 grit. So 4000 grit's going to kind of be our final polish here, or our final abrasive grit, I should say. And then we're going to do a polish with a wool bonnet on the buffer. And we'll just kind of go over the whole surface lightly. It'll put a little bit of a satin sheen to it. Not quite a gloss. And it'll also finish dressing up that epoxy, so it's very, very clear now. And we can clearly see the wood all the way to the bottom of the epoxy. All right, with this bench all finished, we'll look at a couple of close-up shots, and you can see that pretty spectacular grain figure there. Doesn't even look flat. Oh, it really has a 3D look to it. And there's that bench all complete. I think it's a pretty nice look overall. It'll make a great piano bench for them. A little bit wider than a normal piano bench, of course, but my daughters, 2 or 3 of them at a time, like to sit there and play songs on the piano, and they've got this collaboration thing that they do. And of course, got a good shot with the bench dog. You guys will have to tell me in the comments down below what you think of the red epoxy in this bench. Okay, so you remember I told you this whole thing was about doing multiple projects from a single plan. I'm going to show you one more project, and I'm going to make it quick. And this is pretty cool. You might want to see this, because this may be the perfect way for you to start. So while I was wrapping up the other bench, I called my friend Michael Long from MK Designs Fine Woodworking. He also has a YouTube channel, and I asked him if he could come up and build this version of the bench for us. And he was happy to come up and help, and so he's going to build this, and I'm just going to kind of quickly talk you through it. Same deal. He's cut all of our pieces to length. Now he's going to cut the same set of templates out, just exactly like I did. And I want to say thanks to Mike for coming up and doing this for me. Really helps out. He's always there when I need a hand. Maybe you guys could even do me a favor and go over to his YouTube channel. I'll put a link down below and subscribe to his channel. In fact, I'm going to do a random drawing here. Anybody who sees this video, just make a little comment down below and say you subscribed over on Mike's, and we'll go check, make sure that you did. And I'm going to give away 3 sets of plans to this bench at random to 3 different people who went over there and subscribed to his channel. Just my way of kind of saying thanks to Mike, and maybe you guys could help me out. Go subscribe to him, and we'll help his channel grow. And you won't be disappointed. You'll like his channel. He does a lot of cool stuff. In fact, he's an expert with the CNC, and he started a new series about tech in the shop, with talking about CNC stuff and how to build projects with it, how to use your CNC, how to get the most out of it, and you're going to really like it. So maybe give him a try. All right, so he's got the parts now all cut out for the top of the bench. And those are going into place. Next, he is going to cut the bevel cuts on the legs, and it'll be kind of the same technique that we did for the more elegant indoor bench. This outdoor bench is put together basically the same way, but it makes it a completely different project, partly because just the lumber that we're using. And in using the 2x4s, we're going to kind of leave this rustic look. 2x4s are kind of sanded round a little bit on the edges, and we're not going to attempt to plane them square or do anything like that. We're just going to leave them round. We're just going to leave these as regular, everyday 2x4s and put the bench together. It's going to give the project a completely unique look. It isn't going to look anything like the bench we did for indoors. It's perfectly functional, like a bench, of course, but it just has a really nice rustic look for outdoors. It's also an easy project, and it's an inexpensive project. All right, so he's going to mark these out, which cuts are which. And then, as you know, there are long versions and short versions, because some come to the top of the bench and some go under the top bench boards. And then it's on to the bandsaw to cut those bevels out. So that's one thing you do really kind of need for this project, is a bandsaw. It can be a really inexpensive bandsaw that you could pick up at Home Depot. They've got a bandsaw there for like $129. It would work just fine. You could use a jigsaw, but you need a really long blade. Festool does make jigsaw blades that are about 6 inches long. They would cut it. It would be a lot of work, and it wouldn't be perfect, but it would work. But ideally you would have a bandsaw. But other than that, you really don't need much for this project. You don't even need a table saw. Just a circular saw, maybe a drill, a sander. He did take the router and round over the corners of the ones that he had cut square on the bandsaw, because we want to keep that same round look going throughout. Make everything look like it's just pieces of 2x4 assembling the bench. So my daughter Rima is going to help him assemble it here. This is actually my second oldest daughter. You haven't seen her in too many videos, but she's actually helping out in the shop full time now. It's been a while since she's been here doing anything. She's done some projects before, but she's back now, and she missed woodworking quite a bit, so she's going to have some fun for the next year or so at least, hopefully, helping us out. All right, so they're going to clamp the leg together. And got to get clamps on both sides to kind of prevent the warp. We can take the excess glue out with a straw cut at an angle. And then, of course, take a damp rag and get kind of as much of the excess out as you can. And then we let that sit up in the clamps for not too long, because this whole project is more or less built in a day. And you see it's got the high and the low sections because of how it goes together with the top. All right, so they let both of those set up for about maybe somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, actually, I think. And then they're jumping on the tabletop. I wish I could have built the indoor bench in the same amount of time that they did this one in. I'm going to give a shout out to our King's Fine Woodworking community on Facebook. It's a private Facebook group for woodworkers only. It's a place where you can share your work or see other people's work or get help on projects you're currently on. If you're interested, there's a link in the description below. And they're going to put this in place temporarily to mark the distances of these, because they have to stick out on each end by certain distances, and I'm going to help them out there. I've got stuff in the clamps gluing up, so I've got a moment to help. And that's kind of how those look when that occurs. And of course, they've got to get it flat using the Thor's hammers, the only way to bring these things flat. So if you don't have one, you probably need to get one. We have those on our website, or you can get plans and make one. And then we want to take the glue off. This is my wife, Rupa. She's helping get the glue off. I just realized why Mike was faster. It's because he had everybody in the world helping him. Yeah, it was just me all by myself on the other bench. Nobody helped me at all. All right, so that's done. After about 30 minutes, we pulled that out of the glue up. And now he's preparing to glue the entire project together. And this glue up, he'll probably just leave in the clamps overnight and let it get a good cure. But it's no problem to pull pieces of it out early. And once again, you do want to glue up every contact surface. I'm a big fan of that. It's important not to have any shortages of glue. You want as much strength as you can get. Titebond has quite a bit of strength. We're using Titebond 3 for this bench because it's an outdoor bench, but it has quite a bit of strength. But you really got to make sure you have glue in every area. I see a lot of times people will just put a string of glue on one side and then clamp it, and sometimes those joints comes apart, and you can tell that they haven't been fully glued. Whereas if they were fully glued, maybe they wouldn't come apart over time. So this thing is going to take a lot of clamps. So I had a few minutes, so I'm helping out a bit too. And it's clamped from side to side and from top to bottom. And there are squares in each corner, big 1/4-inch steel squares or 1/4-inch aluminum squares on the other side, the woodpecker squares, that we're clamping in place to keep the top square. All right, so overnight we finished. And we're taking this out of the clamps. Mike had to go back home, so I'm going to wrap this up. But he really did the whole build for me, so thanks again, Mike. And remember, guys, go and subscribe to Mike's channel. I'm going to put a link down below. All right, so there we go. The bench is assembled, glued up, cured, and dried, and now it is time to do some sanding. The first thing I want to do is sand in all of these grooves because there's some visible glue that we didn't really get fully cleaned out. So I've got a set of these soft sander sanding pads, and they have different profiles on them. So I find one that kind of fits the contour that I'm looking for, and that's this guy right here. We just take a regular piece of sandpaper, fold it to kind of fit that edge of that profile. There we go. And then we can just sand with this. This is actually relatively fast. You can put a pretty aggressive paper in there and get it down to where you need quickly, and then go up a grit or two to smooth it out. And so we basically did this around the whole tabletop, or the whole bench top, the legs and underneath as well. And then I just manually sort of rounded over the edges of these things as well. And I have another little tool here I was going to show you. I think this might be discontinued by Festool. And what this does is this sands in a line. It's a linear sander, so it just goes up and down in one motion, and it doesn't orbit. That's it. But it's really good for sanding things like this. In all honesty, it isn't any faster than sanding by hand, but it's less work. It's actually a really slow sander. I think that's probably why they discontinued it. But it is less work to do a lot of sanding because it's really no work to hold the machine in place, whereas you have to, manually drag the pad back and forth when you're doing it that way. But I just wanted to show that as an option in case anybody has those. This is a great use for it. Once I have all those crevices sanded, I'm just going to sand the flats. And I'm a big fan of Festool sanders. I don't have all the Festool stuff. I've got quite a few tools, but to me the sanders really stand out. They're very, very special. Much better than your standard sander out there. All right, so this is the underside. Now, it's a possibility that if you get a bunch of real heavy people in here, it could rack back and forth. This doesn't have the same glue area as the regular bench, and we could just put some sort of a rectangular board up in here to considerably increase the glue surface area. And that's what I did. I kind of chamfered it down on the edges and across the middle there, put a bevel on it. And I think we'll just attach these in place with some glue. And that's going to add so much more glue surface area and add a lot of strength in case you get some rambunctious teenagers jumping on this thing. So I'll apply a good quantity of glue to both sides of this and put it into the corner. I'm going to tack it in with pin nails. And that's going to provide quite a bit of strength, probably an extra few thousand pounds worth of total holding strength on this bench. And that's really all that you need. If you were very concerned and might be putting a whole lot of weight on this bench, you could always add screws. And that's not very hard. And it'd be the only hardware really in this. And just pre-drill 3 holes on the top and then on the side, and put those screws in. And now this bench really is extremely strong. Probably far stronger than it needs to be. So it's time to put a finish on our bench. We need a really good finish, so I'm choosing Pinafin, which is something I like to use for all my projects. The bench itself is Douglas fir. It's not the best wood for outdoors, but if you do a really good quality finish, it's still going to last. It's going to be fine. We'll take care of it. We have to put the finish every few years, but that's no big deal because literally it only costs $20 and change, less than 21 bucks to buy all 5 of these 2x4 8-footers for this whole bench. So it's a very inexpensive outdoor project and a pretty fast one too. The key is just get a good finish on it so it'll last well. You could obviously choose cedar, redwood. You could even move up to even nicer stuff like a teak bench. Doing that, you could add other embellishments to it, different edge profiles, and once again, it kind of fits with a theme where you're going to get a different project from the same set of plans. It really just depends on the lumber you're using, the finish you use, the router profiles you're putting on it. If you do any other curves or add anything to it at all, it just adds to the fact that you can make different things really with the same plan. So we just want to make sure that we have this fully and thoroughly coated everywhere, and then we're going to wipe all the excess off. You got to move fairly quick, maybe 5 or 10 minutes to get the whole thing wiped down or get the whole thing applied well, and then wipe it off. That way you get a more uniform and even finish on it. We always apply a finish to the underside of our projects first and the top side last. That way we don't have to flip it upside down on the top that already has the finish completed on it. But the procedure is exactly the same here. We're just going to put a good coat on the whole thing, let it soak in for a minute or so, and then wipe the excess off. Pinafin is actually a really easy finish to apply. In fact, most outdoor finishes are easy to apply, especially if they're oil-based finishes. If you're using a film-based finish, there's usually a little more work involved, but I'm not a big fan of those for outdoors. They tend to peel and crack and chip and flake, and they're just harder to maintain. Whereas this, I don't have to do anything to it other than add another coat the exact same way in a few years. Yeah, my daughter Rima made pretty quick work of putting the finish on the bench. I think it took her less than 7 or 8 minutes to do the whole thing and wipe off all the excess. And this bench is pretty much ready to go. We'll take it outdoors after this and put it into use. It's a great outdoor project for spring. Spring is coming up. Along with our Adirondack chairs, we've got outdoor picnic tables, things like that, and this would be a good addition to that furniture. And plans for all of that is available on the website. Well, you made it all the way to the end. I can't believe you did that, and I can't thank you enough. Please hit that notification bell and make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and thanks for watching.